The file was innocuous at first glance, EO412's call.wav. It lay buried in the digital crypt of WZRP 103.5 FM, a crumbling radio station tucked in the shadowed folds of Mill County, Vermont. 12:47 a.m., April 12th. No one recalled saving it. No one claimed to have tagged it. It was as if the file had willed itself into being, a ghost born in the station's neglected archives. When it was finally played, months later in a dimly lit room cluttered with dusty equipment, every soul in that room fell silent. The air grew heavy, the kind of stillness that presses against your ribs. You hear the host, Richard Mayfield. His voice is calm, routine, a man who spent decades taming the night. He's wrapping up a mundane weather report when the switchboard crackles. A sharp burst of static slices through, and then a voice. It's male, mid-40s. No ambient noise, no wind, no hum of a car, no trace of the world beyond his words. Just a faint, jagged static framing his voice, like a frayed wire sparking in the dark. "I've been walking for hours," he says, his tone eerily measured. "The tower lights are still ahead. They don't move. I'm not getting closer." Richard pauses. A faint creak escapes his chair as he shifts. Then a forced chuckle, the kind you use to mask unease. As if he's a prank, a late-night caller spinning a tale. But the man presses on, his voice steady, unnervingly so. "My headlights are still on. I left the engine running, but the trees, they won't let me go back. Every path I take, every turn, it pulls me deeper." He doesn't shout, he doesn't plead. He observes as if reciting a dream he can't wake from. There are no shadows anymore. The ground is slick, wet, but it hasn't rained. And I think I saw myself from above. Just for a moment, then it was gone. Richard's composure cracks. His voice trembles slightly as he interrupts. "What's your name, sir?" A long pause. The static swells, a low growl that seems to pulse with intent. Then, faintly, "Dale Kendrick." Another silence. Richard clears his throat, promising to send help. He speaks quickly, as if trying to outrun the unease crawling up his spine. But the line cuts. No click, no warning, just a void where the voice once was. The show stumbles forward. Another call comes through. The night continues. No one speaks of it. Not yet. Not until the next morning at 10:12 a.m. Angela Linwood, the overnight producer, sifts through her inbox. A county bulletin catches her eye, forwarded by her cousin in dispatch. A hiker's body was found at 7:40 a.m., 5 miles off Highway 6. The corpse was curled tight, knees to chest, fingers caked with dirt as if clawing at the earth. No phone, no ID. But a wallet was recovered, snagged in the tatters of a coat nearby. Name: Dale Kendrick. Time of death: 2 nights prior. Cause: hypothermia, disorientation, shock trauma. Angela's breath catches. She checks the radio log, her fingers trembling. Dale Kendrick called at 12:47 a.m., the morning after he died. They thought it was a mistake, a glitch, maybe an old recording misfiled in the system. But this was a live broadcast. The caller responded to Richard's questions. He paused, he reacted, and his voice, every pitch, every cadence, matched a voicemail Dale left for his sister 3 days earlier. No software could fake it. No edit could replicate the raw, human weight of his words. No one could explain how a dead man's voice pierced the airwaves, or how he described details only investigators would later uncover. A shattered flashlight, its lens smeared with mud. A phone with its battery torn out. Bark stuffed deep in his mouth as if to silence a scream. All of it spoken by the voice. Hours before the scene was found. After that night, WZRP 103.5 FM unraveled. 3 staff members quit within weeks. Angela vanished 6 weeks later, her apartment left untouched, her phone still on the counter. Richard was institutionalized the following spring, muttering that someone else had stolen his voice. The tape, the original 0412 call.wav, was erased, overwritten, burned to a disk, and hurled into the Black River. But something endured. A backup, forgotten on a dust-choked external drive, hidden in a server rack. Tonight, for the first time, you'll hear fragments of that call. But know this, This wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't a hoax. It was a transmission, a signal from somewhere beyond. Something slipped through the wires that night, and it never left. To understand the terror that gripped April 12th, we must step into the heart of Mill County, Vermont, a place where the world feels forgotten. Mill County is no tourist haven. It's a speck on the map, swallowed by dense forests that crowd the edges of town. The silence here is oppressive, broken only by the crack of branches or the hum of a lone car on a distant road. Locals live by the land's pulse. The slow turn of seasons, the howl of winter winds, the faint crackle of radios that keep the night at bay. In this quiet, under a sky heavy with stars, WZRP 103.5 FM stood as a beacon. The station was a relic, its walls peeling like old skin, wires tangled like veins in a dying beast. The soundboard, scorched from years of use, carried the faint scent of burnt plastic and stale coffee. Every night, WZRP opened its lines to the weary, truckers navigating endless highways, nurses pulling graveyard shifts, insomniacs clutching radios like lifelines. Richard Mayfield was their anchor. With a voice like worn leather, Richard had spent decades behind the mic. He was steady, unshakable, a warm presence in the cold dark. He'd heard it all: drunken confessions, conspiracy rants, whispered fears. But he listened, always with a quiet compassion that made callers feel seen. Then there was Angela Linwood, the overnight producer. Young, sharp, and tireless, she was the station's backbone, juggling calls and keeping the show alive while Richard wove stories into the night. To outsiders, it was just a small-town radio show. To Mill County, it was a tether, a fragile thread stitching together lives across the vast, lonely woods. But on April 12th, as the clock inched toward 12:47 a.m., that thread began to fray. Outside the forest was a wall of shadow, silent save for the soft rustle of pine needles and the distant hoot of a barred owl. Clouds smothered the moon, casting the world in a suffocating dark. Somewhere in that void, Dale Kendrick wandered. Dale was a local, a man carved from the land. An experienced hiker, he knew the forest's moods and its trails, its dangers, its secrets. Friends called him cautious, always prepared, never reckless. But that night, something lured him off the paths he knew. Something unseen, something that didn't belong. Inside the studio, Richard settled into his rhythm, the hum of equipment and the scratch of static a familiar comfort. Angela monitored the call lines, her eyes flicking between screens, waiting for the next voice to break the night. Then, without warning, a line flared red. A man's voice spilled through the speakers, calm, deliberate, almost hypnotic. "I've been walking for hours," he said. "The tower lights are always ahead, but they never get closer, no matter which way I turn." Richard's brow furrowed. He leaned forward, intrigued but wary. "Where are you calling from?" he asked. The voice paused, then answered, "I don't know anymore." The line crackled, a faint pulse beneath the words. The man spoke of headlights burning in a car he couldn't find, of a road that had vanished. No wind stirred, no insects chirped, no birds called, only a silence so deep it felt like a weight on the chest. "I think I'm trapped," he whispered. Richard pressed for details, but the man's words grew disjointed, as if he were slipping further away with each breath. "There are no shadows. I can't find my shadow." A chill ran through Richard. His fingers tightened on the mic. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and something sharper, like rot. The static on the radio pulsed, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat trapped in the wires. 5 miles away, search teams mobilized, flashlights cutting through the dark. Reports had trickled in of a man missing since the previous night, last seen near the forest's edge. The town held its breath. Hours crawled by. The call ended abruptly, leaving only silence. But the night was only beginning. In the days that followed, the truth unraveled in ways no one could have foreseen. Dale Kendrick's body was found, cold, rigid, alone. But the timeline was impossible. He had been dead for 2 days when his voice spoke live on air. The questions mounted, each more unsettling than the last. What was Dale trying to tell them? What had he encountered in those woods? And how could his voice, so vivid, so real, reach through the airwaves after death? This isn't just the story of a lost man. It's the story of a signal. Something that crossed boundaries no one can name, carried on invisible waves. Something that began in the forest and didn't end there. Tonight, you'll hear voices from beyond, see the places where reality cracks, and meet those who paid the price for listening. Listen closely. Some messages are meant to be heard only once. And sometimes, once is enough to change everything. When the first call ended, the studio fell silent. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This was heavier, alive, as if the air itself had thickened with an unseen presence. Richard tried to move on, his voice steady but strained, guiding the show into its next segment. But the tension clung to him, a shadow he couldn't shake. The phone lines, usually alive with chatter, stayed dark. Angela, at the controls, noticed something odd. Faint spikes on the soundboard, bursts of static that didn't align with any known interference. The clock ticked forward, each second stretching into eternity. Outside, the forest seemed to creep closer, its shadows twisting in the dim glow of the station's lone street lamp. Then, just after 1 a.m., a new sound pierced the quiet. A slow, deliberate tap, 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 faint but rhythmic, like fingers brushing against wood. Richard's eyes darted around the studio, searching for the source. The room was empty, the door locked. Angela leaned into her headset, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that?" The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was too sharp, too complete. Minutes later, a low creak groaned from somewhere outside. Not the wind, but something heavier, as if the station's old wooden walls were flexing under an unseen weight. "Probably just the building settling," Richard muttered, but his voice betrayed him, thin and unconvincing. In the woods, search teams pressed deeper, their flashlights slicing through the dark. But the forest fought back. Tracks appeared, then dissolved into nothing. Voices, faint, fragmented, drifted through the trees, tangled with the wind, as if the woods themselves were murmuring secrets. Back at the station, Richard's voice grew quieter, his words clipped. Then the calls resumed. A man on a lonely highway swore he heard footsteps trailing him. Steps that matched his pace but stopped when he did, never overtaking. A woman spoke of figures in the fog, shapes that melted when she turned to look. But it was the third call that froze Richard's blood. A woman, her voice trembling, said she'd found a tape among her late grandfather's things. On it, a voice, unmistakably Dale Kendrick's, spoke of being watched, of something in the woods waiting. The tape ended with a whisper, barely audible. "It's inside." Static surged, swallowing her final words. Richard's hand hovered over the console, torn between cutting the feed and letting it play. Curiosity won. He hit record. Outside, the wind grew sharper, carrying the stench of wet earth and decay. Then came the shadows. Not the kind cast by light, but something else. Shapes that slithered along walls, pooling in corners, moving when no one looked. Angela glimpsed one near the window. A dark silhouette, too tall, too still. She blinked and it was gone. The air grew colder, the static pulsing erratically like a heart struggling to beat. Richard's breaths came shallow, his eyes fixed on the mic as if it might speak on its own. The studio, once a sanctuary, felt alien now, a place where the impossible pressed against the real. Questions hung heavy. What had followed Dale? Was it still out there? And if it could hijack a radio? What else could it do? The clock neared 2 a.m. The phone rang again. The voice was faint, fractured, barely human. "It's inside," it rasped, "and it knows you're listening." Before Richard could respond, the line died. Static flooded the studio, a tidal wave of noise. The lights flickered. Once, twice. In that fleeting darkness, the room felt impossibly vast, and utterly empty. For those listening at home, a question burned. Would you answer that call knowing what might be on the other end? Would you listen to a voice that shouldn't exist? In Mill County, the night doesn't just fall, it waits. And some voices refuse to fade. The studio was a battlefield, besieged by strange calls, rogue shadows, and a silence that felt like a predator stalking its prey. Richard's voice, once a beacon, had cracked, his words stumbling over unanswered questions. Angela's hands shook as she monitored the controls, her eyes darting to the windows, half expecting something to stare back. As dawn's faint glow crept toward the horizon, the line crackled to life one final time. A voice emerged, clear but hollow, as if echoing from a place no signal should reach. "You don't know what's behind the static," it said. "It's waiting, watching, listening." Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. He leaned closer to the mic, his voice barely steady. "Who is this?" Silence. Then a slow, deliberate breathing. Not human, not animal, but something older, heavier, seeping through the speakers like a presence coiling in the room. A whisper followed, sharp and broken. "I'm not alive, but I'm still here." The studio plunged into darkness. The power died, leaving only the faint red glow of the emergency console. Richard fumbled for the flashlight, his hands trembling. The radio crackled, and the voice returned, unbidden. "2 days ago I was taken," it said. "Not by men, not by beasts. Something older, something hungry. It found me in the woods. I ran, but it's inside now." A burst of static drowned the words. When it cleared, the voice was gone. Angela's voice cut through from the back room, high and panicked. "Richard, we need to call the police." But Richard was frozen, his eyes locked on the microphone, the air thick with a presence that seemed to watch them. The line flared again. A series of sharp beeps, then a low hum, like a chant from some forgotten tongue. The sound vibrated in the walls, pulsed beneath the floor, wrapped around them like a living thing. 5 miles away, search teams heard it too. A wail rising from the forest, mournful and alive, twisting through the trees. One by one, their radios fell silent. In the studio, a cold breeze swept through, sharp and unnatural, carrying the scent of blood and rust. Then, without warning, a recording began to play. It was Dale Kendrick's voice, but different, frantic, raw with terror. "It's inside me," he gasped. "I feel it moving, watching, waiting. It's not just in the woods anymore." The microphone crackled, warping into a voice that wasn't human. A guttural echo that seemed to claw at the air. "We're all listening," it said. "You can't hide behind your machines." Richard stumbled back, the chair crashing to the floor. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with primal fear. Angela's flashlight swept the room, landing on the window. A figure stood there. Tall, motionless, its edges blurred, as if carved from the dark itself. She blinked, and it was gone. The power surged back. Silence, but the terror lingered, a stain that wouldn't fade. Days later, investigators found no cause for the blackout, no trace of the broadcast. The recordings were gone, replaced by hours of blank static. Dale Kendrick's body was found miles from the station, eyes wide, mouth locked in a silent scream. The police report defied logic. The radio call came 2 days after his death. The voices, real or not, remain a mystery. Some call it a glitch, a cruel trick of technology. Others whisper of something else, like a presence that lingers between life and death, riding the airwaves to speak, to warn, to hunt. In Mill County, long after the station went silent, locals still hear faint crackles on 103.5 FM. Voices that shouldn't exist, whispers that chill the blood. The last caller was already dead, but what came through that night was more than a voice. It was a message, a warning. Something is still out there, and it's listening. WZRP 103.5 FM went dark for 6 weeks after that night. Richard never returned to the mic. He wasn't declared missing, he wasn't found. His apartment stood untouched, his car still parked outside the station, keys in the ignition. Yet his voice, or something like it, has been heard, faint and fleeting, in the static picked up by amateur radio hobbyists in Mill County's deepest hours. The tape Angela saved, the one with Dale's voice, it melted. The magnetic strip corroded inside a sealed, climate-controlled cabinet. The casing warped as if scorched. Experts called it heat damage, but the room never rose above 18 degrees. Angela quit that week. She fled to Arizona, a place without forests, without radios, without echoes. She refuses to speak of that night, her silence louder than any confession. The station was razed a year later, but the demolition crew told stories that never made the reports. As they tore down the transmission tower, voices echoed through the concrete. Soft, overlapping, like children whispering in a hollow pipe. One worker swore he heard a voice say, "Don't forget me." Half the crew walked off the job, their faces pale, their tools left behind. The frequency, 103.5 FM, was never reassigned. It's dead air now, or so they claim. Because in the witching hours, if you tune just right, some say you can still hear a voice. calling for help, warning you, begging, and the question remains: if you heard a voice on the other end, a voice that couldn't be alive, would you listen? Would you answer? Would you speak into the void knowing what might reply? Or would you cut the line and pray it doesn't find you? Tell me in the comments, would you have taken that call? Would you have stayed on the air, hearing a dead man's voice? And have you ever heard something on the radio that you couldn't explain? If you've braved this story to its end, you're among the few who dare to linger in the dark. Subscribe if the unknown calls to you. We uncover true horror, true mystery, where fear and fact collide. New stories every week, each one darker than the last. And remember, a silent voice doesn't mean it's gone. It means it's listening. Until next time, keep your lights dim, keep your radio clear. And if your phone rings after midnight, ask yourself, who's really calling?